journalism, and specifically for Latina journalism in the United States. And just to start us off, before we get into the specifics of your many projects, if you could talk about what it means to you to be a trailblazer and to be spoken of as.
Okay, I'm going to be honest with you. First of all, thank you so much for this extraordinary honor and for bringing me back to Maine. Oh my God, I had such a beautiful morning walk, and then I was on the water making offerings. So thank you so much, President, and to my friend Andy. It's really great to be here. And to Liz and Nadia as well, who have been wonderful hosts. So I don't really wake up and I'm like, what do I think about being a trailblazer? So I don't really think about it. And that's, for me as a journalist, it's very important because I know you all were just kind of like, can you wrap it up with the awards? Because it's like, I'm very self-conscious about receiving too many awards because I never want young journalists in particular to think like, well, I could never do that. But the awards were never the reason. And even being the first was not a reason. When I wrote Once I Was You, I remember being really surprised by when I started to get press on the book. And people were like, well, what was it like to be the first Latina ever hired at NPR editorial? And I was like, well, the year was 1985 and we were in a recession and I was just really happy to have a job. Sounds familiar? Capitalism is great, Andy. So to me, it is my commitment to our profession and that mission being clearly kind of rooted in what I understood actually by going to Barnard College, by going to the University of Chicago High School, which was, wow, I have some ridiculous privilege. And it wasn't financial. My dad, may he rest in peace, helped to create the cochlear implant. He was a medical doctor researcher, so he lived grant to grant like I do. So it wasn't a financial privilege, but it was intellectual privilege, it was a class privilege, it was academic privilege. And when I understood my privilege is when I was like, okay, so now I understand what my responsibility is. And that is the thing that has been kind of my North Star, to quote my godfather in American journalism, Frederick Douglass. That has been my North Star, is what am I doing? And defining myself proudly as a journalist of conscience in the United States of America.
Definitely. Yeah. So speaking on that theme of being a journalist of conscience, throughout your Pulitzer Prize-winning podcast, Suave, you exhibit this unique style of journalism, one that centers around an intimate and deep relationship you've forged with your source, David Luis Suave Gonzalez. And we know that you get asked about Suave a lot, for good reason. I think I was struck in listening to your podcast of just how you referred to your habit of sending a Christmas card, of welcoming him into your life as more than just a source to mine information from, but as a tool and as a friend. And you both talk about and exemplify an emphasis on humanity through your journalism. Can you share a little bit more about how you came to know this method of storytelling and what it's like to be so close to your subjects? You also, if you'd like to give more context around how this project came to be.
Okay. Can I have you listen to Suave? Okay, just the two of you. For the rest of you, I know that Liz, over dinner last night, Nadia was talking about Suave a little obsessively. That's okay, Nadia. It's an obsessive thing. The reason why I'm saying that is because then Liz, who hadn't listened to Suave, at the end of the night, after dropping us off, Liz is like, I went home and I listened to episode 1 and episode 2, and I was like, and then you went to sleep? Because it's, it is, once you start listening, you'll be like, oh my God, I need to know what happened. So what happened with Suave, just in a very little nutshell, is that I get invited in the year 1993 to go give a commencement speech at a maximum security men's prison in Pennsylvania. And as a journalist, I root a lot of what I do also not only in the heart but in data. And at that time, I knew that the prison population was one of the fastest growing populations in our country. I don't know if it still is. I need to check that data point. But so I was like, wow, when do you ever get a chance as a journalist to go inside a maximum security men's prison? It's difficult. And to me, this is a problem in a society where there should be free press access, right? We don't have access to prisons. So my husband and I go. My husband accompanies me when I go visit, to give this speech. And because the prisoners were graduating, the incarcerated citizens, as they like to call themselves, they were graduating from BAs or GEDs or plumbing or haircutting, this kind of thing. And at the end of that speech, where I try to always identify with who I'm speaking with. Like, that's why I talked about going to your coast. Where was I again? Harpswell. Because then you'll be like, oh, that's really, I get that. So when I was speaking to inside a prison, I talked about how the fact that I had been to prisons, mostly in Latin America, as a journalist or for other reasons, visiting people I knew. And so that for me, people behind bars are not scary. They're human beings, and this is the nature of the speech that I give. And afterwards, I'm surrounded by a group of men. Many of them were lifers, that is, in for life. And then I hear this young man, at that time Suave was probably in his late 20s, and he said, yo, I'm from, and this is in Pennsylvania, so he says, yo, I'm from the South Bronx. It's Suave, man, I'm from New York, and I'm gonna be here for life. I'm a juvenile lifer. And I was like, a juvenile lifer, what's that? It means that he was sentenced as a juvenile to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And so he said, I'm gonna be here for life. What can I do? What can I do? I wanna do something. And then the journalist in me was like, oh my God, wait, what, you wanna talk to me? You wanna stay in touch with me? Be my source. I was like, well, this is great. Be my source. Let me know everything that's happening inside a maximum security men's prison. You can be, and it's a term I don't use anymore. I was like, you can be the voice for the voiceless. I don't believe people are voiceless, so that's not a right term to use. You can give voice to people who need to be heard, would have been appropriate. But I said, give voice to the voiceless. And this clicks in Suave's mind. He's a very smart man, even though he had not finished high school, he had dropped out. And I was newly married. My husband and I had been together for 2 years. My mom always sent Christmas cards. By hand, would send the Christmas cards. It was like a thing that we did in our family. And my husband and I were newly married, and so we were taking our little pictures of like, look at us, we're so cute. And sending them as Christmas cards to our friends. And my husband had met Suave. Suave knew me. And I knew his address. I knew where he was going to be for the rest of his life. And I was like, how can I not? How can I not send him a Christmas card? And so I started sending Christmas cards, which were simply a way of saying, hi, we both met you, and we haven't forgotten you. And I think also a way of saying, journalistically, you're staying in touch with somebody, right? I did go interview Suave a couple of times in those first 3 years. And then, 25 years pass, and I would hear from Suave sometimes, for 7 years he was in the hole, i.e. in solitary confinement, so I didn't hear from him. But the cards were not returned, so I knew they were getting there. And then the Supreme Court, when it was a different Supreme Court, a very, very different Supreme Court, it takes on the question of, is it inhumane to sentence a juvenile to life in prison without the possibility of parole? And they say it is inhumane, you can no longer do this. And then they open up the possibility for these cases like Suave's to be grandfathered. And when I start hearing this around 2014 is when I say, oh my God, there's a story here. And that's when Suave and I start recording every single phone call that we have. Because I just thought, what if he gets out? Which was, to me, never a possibility. And then Suave gets out, and then things happen, and then nobody in my company understood what the story was because they had never met Suave. To them, to my colleagues in my own company, Suave was an interruption. He was a problem. He was a time suck. They had never met him. They didn't know anything about him. And so trying to convince my team, my own team, which you're going to both have to do if you continue in your life as journalists, right? You will have to fight for your stories in my own company. You have to believe in your stories, right? And I knew that there was something here. And that's when finally we get a little bit of money, because if you're a nonprofit, it's hard to do this without money. And so we were able to have a producer just sit and listen to all of those phone calls. And that's when she came back and said, there is a story here, but you can't be involved in the production, Maria, because you are part of the story. And we're going to tell the story of a journalist and a source. So we are about to finish season 2. So you are actually privy to kind of a moment. Those of you who will go and listen to Suave, this is a moment. I actually made an offering, a spiritual offering, at the water today. In fact, for healing, for moving forward with Suave season 2. It has been, if you think season 1 is dramatic, and the reason why is because people think like, oh, when you get out of prison, you're out, and it's like, yes. And actually, the journalism of covering someone coming out of prison who's been in for 31 years and went in as a 17-year-old. That's where we are right now in the story, and it's all I can tell you is that it's really dramatic, and I think a lot of people are going to be a little bit surprised by what ends up happening, and that's all I'm going to say. It's just a roller coaster, but as I said to my team on our 10 o'clock editorial call this morning, I said, whatever happens, we are here for the journalism. And ultimately, I do believe Suave profoundly knows and understands this. So whatever happens between him and I, separate and apart, hint, Suave season 2 is dramatic. We are doing journalism. And that I am so 100% committed to it. And to being really transparent, which is why I believe it won the Pulitzer Prize, is because we were openly transparent about all of the things that were happening to us, to me, as a journalist, which is the way I recorded my offering today. I was recording it because we're kind of obsessive like that. We record everything. I record everything that has to do with Suave.
Now, in Once I Was You, you tell the story about when your family was crossing into America for the first time, and an immigration agent tries to detain you as you were, what, 1 year old at the time?
Yeah, just about.
And your mother quite literally has to almost fight this man. And now, many, many years after that, you have been working on the front line of the border, doing journalism there for several years. And I think a lot of people look at that and they say that's a conflict of interest and that can't be good reporting because this person has a personal experience in this and now they're reporting on it. Where's the objectivity? But you've kind of turned that into something that gives you an advantage. And I just wanted to know kind of how does that affect both how you approach the journalism that you're doing, but also the way that people receive it?
So I love this question. There's so many things. I mean, we could just talk about this for the whole hour, so let me try and simplify. So Andy and I are journalists, right? Andy, who is the God of objectivity? He just said it, nobody. We need to understand this. Our responsibility as journalists is to be profoundly aware of the world that we are operating in and to be fair, right? Also, to question that there are always both sides to a story. Because, let's see, are there in fact both sides to children being held in cages in the United States of America? Are there? You know, Saturday Night Live once did a spoof about PBS, actually, and they said, tonight on the NewsHour, the pros and cons of cannibalism. Okay? So it is our responsibility to have critical thinking about the world around us and to not actually just be, well, Well, but what about, what about the story of what happens to me, which my mother was not really a kind of in su cuerpo. She didn't really profoundly understand what had happened until Donald Trump is elected and there is a decision to make a policy to take children away. That was the policy. You're coming with a baby, come in, you're going to be detained and we're taking your child. Why? To cause pain and to believe that this will make people not cross. By the way, on the border, talking to people about to cross with their children in the midst that this was happening, and I asked somebody, you have to be very clear what you're doing as a journalist in this moment. This person is about to walk into the United States, her dream, and she doesn't know that the policy is to take your child. So I asked her, what have you heard about what's happening in the United States when you cross into the United States and you have a child? No, pues nada. Have you heard that there's a possibility that they may take your child from you? No, eso no pasaría. No, that would never happen. So it is a policy that was created when our colleagues at ProPublica break the story of inside recording the voices of the babies and toddlers crying for their families, which we all heard. My mother hears this and calls me up crying. And she's like, oh my God, this is what almost happened. And I was like, what are you talking about? When we had the situation, we came by plane. My father was already at the University of Chicago waiting for us. So my mother had understood she had privilege because we had green cards. And with a green card, the agent said, we're just going to take your little girl. I'm just going to keep her because I had a rash. He was like, I'm just going to keep her and put her into quarantine. You can go off to Chicago. You and your other children can go off to, we're just going to hold her here. In the airport? In Dallas? What were they going to do with me? You know, and for a long time, even when I was writing, once I was you, I was like, well, it must have been just like some guy, a fluke. Like, why would he? I mean, he was having a bad day, or he just, no. They took children. I wasn't the first. My mom happened to lose her marbles, and the only thing that she had, because she's petite like me, was she had her voice. And that's when she starts yelling at the agent. Mm-hmm. And anyway, when my mom calls me to tell me that all of this is making sense to her, she's in her 80s in 2017. At that moment, actually, was when I was like, oh my God, now I understand why I do the journalism that I do. Why was that the first thing to come out of my mouth? Yes, tears, but then also like, now I understand. And so that question of like, well, you're too immigranty to cover the immigrant, you know. You don't want me to start throwing that around in this room. You don't want me to start questioning, well, you're a little bit too close. You grew up on Wall Street. Sorry, Andy. Thank you. Thank you for the applause. Everybody else is like, what is she talking about? So what I'm trying to say is that, and I really love that you asked the question because it gives me a chance to get on. How dare somebody now, and this is the beautiful thing of having all of those awards. Now is when I'm like, how dare you question my capacity as a journalist because of where I was born? How dare you? If you look at me and think that I have an agenda on this particular issue, then you have no sense of what it is to be a journalist of conscience in the United States of America. And I'm more than happy to sit down and talk with anybody that is I pride myself on being able to talk to anyone, especially with people they may disagree with me. This is our responsibility as journalists, is to be able to have that conversation with anyone and ask questions and enter into dialogue. And actually, you'll be around and you'll remember this. Muchos de aquí ya estaremos en otro lado. We'll be on another plane. But you'll remember this. Because one day, that wall will be torn down. And there will be a president of the United States who will stand on that wall and say, we are going to tear this down. And a Hollywood movie is going to be made about the horrors of what happened here, the way we have Hollywood movies made about, let's see, anything. 3 Mile Island. Nixon and Watergate. Let's see, what else? Anything we make the Hollywood movie years later and just are like, oh, wow, that happened in the United States. The inability to understand international geopolitics, the movement of human beings, the free movement of capital all around the world that therefore will be responded to by the movement of labor. So as I said on MSNBC, what's today? On Wednesday, the Border Patrol is completely inept. And every single administration, post Ronald Reagan, okay, every single one has been completely inept and irresponsible to who we are as the United States of America in understanding the movement of people. Having been just on the border, and now I'm going to be quiet, the Border Patrol says, the wall, it's a speed bump, not stopping anything. And there is no invasion. And listen to Latino USA, we're dropping a piece on this in a couple of weeks because I just got back from the wall. And the Trump administration, and then furthered by the Biden administration, created the situation where you now have sometimes hundreds of people waiting because they created a policy called Remain in Mexico. If we understood flows, people, that no one is trying to come in without getting registered, that's what's happening now, and we understood how to move this flow because we're an advanced technological, industrial, modern society, and it can't be that hard to figure something like that out. Instead, you put a wall, you put a stop, and this is what happens. And so, anyway, I love this conversation, and I feel very proud